Alright everybody, I'm just doing a little video for 5.4 in case you weren't here. Today we're going to kind of combine 5.1, 2, and 3. And it's just going to be a homework. There's not anything for the notes, so this is why I'm just doing a little video on this. So on this assignment, some of the problems I'm going to ask you to solve or graph by switching into vertex form or just switching into intercept form. And then some of your problems, you're going to have the choice, okay? So when maybe would we want to factor, or when would we want to complete this square? So we're just going to do a couple of these problems and see which do you think would be the best. We can try the problem and then make some decisions about maybe these are the types of problems we'd want to factor, and these are the type of problems we'd want to complete the square. So first off, I would recommend that if something can be factored, I think that's probably the best way, especially if we're trying to solve, because the solutions are fairly easy. Once you get those two parentheses, we can find our solutions really quick. So let's maybe try and solve by factoring. So we'd need to find the two things that multiply to negative 21x squared and add or subtract to give us negative 4x. So if we think about that, the only thing that multiplies to 21 is either 21 and 1. That wouldn't work. And we could do 3 and 7. So 3 and 7 can give us 4 if we did maybe negative 7x and a positive 3x. So once we have that, a is 1, so we can just rewrite this using, or putting it into intercept form. So we would get x minus 7 and x plus 3. And then to solve, again, we just maybe want to say, well, this either x minus 7 has got to be equal to 0 or x plus 3 has got to be equal to 0. So we could add 7 to both sides, get x equals 7, or we can subtract 3 to both sides and we get x equals negative 3. So that's not too bad, especially if like a is 1, we can use the shortcut. Let's see how it goes if we complete the square. So I'm going to do it down here. We'd do something like, here's our box. Again, x squared is already a perfect square. We'll take that negative 4x and break it into two parts so that it's still, our length and width would be the same. And then complete the square would have to be 4, but it needs to give us negative 21. So we'd need to subtract 25. So then our equation here would be x minus 2 squared minus 25 is equal to 0. And then we would need to solve. So we would need to add 25. And then we'd square root both sides. So we'd get x minus 2 is equal to the plus or minus 5. And then we would add 2 to both sides. So we'd get 2 plus 5 is 7, or 2 minus 5 gives you negative 3. So we ended up getting the same thing. I think maybe, I don't know, I think maybe factoring might be a little quicker if you can come up with the two things. But again, we can come up with the answer either way. So I would say factoring is good if you can find the two things. Okay? If you prefer to complete the square for everything, that's possible. Okay, and let's see an example of maybe when you wouldn't want to complete the square. So, again, you can do this, but it's not super easy. So I would recommend do factoring if b is odd. Let's see what happens if we try and complete the square. So again, we would have our box, would have x squared. This would be x and x. And we'll cut that in half, so negative 3 halves x, negative 3 halves x. So now we're talking about fractions, which isn't like terrible, but it's not ideal. Maybe a little more difficult. Again, to complete the square, -3 times -3 is 9, and 2 times 2 is 4. So we need to figure out what this would need to be to give us 2. Again, 2 is the same as 8/2. So we need to subtract 8/4. So we need to subtract a 4th. So we'd end up getting x minus 3/2 squared minus a 4th. And then we'd still need to solve. So this process is a little more cumbersome if we get these fractions. Okay, so we'd end up getting x minus 3/2 squared equals 1/4. And then we need to square root both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. So x minus 3/2 is equal to plus or minus 1/2. So again, we can square root the top, we can square root the bottom. Okay, and then the last thing we'd need to do is add 3/2. And we'd end up getting 3/2 plus a 1/2 gives us 4/2, or 2. And then 3/2 minus a 1/2 gives us 2/2, which is just 1. So our answers are going to be x equals 2, 1, or 1, 2. All right, so that's completing the square when b is odd. But if we want to do it factoring, again, we would do x squared minus 3x plus 2. We'd do glasses, so it needs to multiply to 2x squared and adds to -3x. Okay. So here we'd get -2x and minus 1x. That gives us -3x, and if we multiplied, that would give us a positive 2x squared. So then we'd have our two parentheses, x minus 2 and x minus 1. And so our solutions here would be x equals 2 and 1. So that factoring here was a lot quicker. So hint, if b is odd, make sure you give factoring a try. Because see how much shorter this was than completing this square. All right. Okay, and then here is another example. Like here you're like, ooh, well factoring was fairly quick, so maybe let's try it. So here we'd do -1x squared and needs to add or subtract to give us -4x. So the only factors for 1 is 1 and 1. So there's no way you can use 1 and 1 to give us 4. So in some situations you can't factor. So we would have to complete the square. Okay. So here we would have x squared minus 2x minus 2x and 4. And then this would need to be -5 to give us that -1. So then we'd end up getting x minus 2 squared minus 5. Would add 5 to both sides. Would square root both sides. So we get x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 5. And then we'd need to add 2. So those would be our solutions, 2 plus the square root of 5 and 2 minus the square root of 5. And that's why we can't do factoring. At least, I mean, you could, but it'd be very difficult to come up with it. Like the two things that would make that work would be 2 plus, or I guess, plus the square root of 5 and 2 minus the square root of 5. So here is an example where you can only complete the square. So again, just a recap. You'd want to factor if you can find it, okay? I think that is very useful if you can just factor. If a problem asks you to find the x-intercepts, then I would recommend factoring first because you find your x-intercepts really quickly. You don't really have to solve, okay? You can just look at those and say, ooh, our x-intercepts are going to give us -3 and -3, 0 and 7, 0. So that's fairly easy. If you're asking for the vertex, I would just go to vertex form. Okay? And then if I'm just asking you to solve, then again, factoring's great if you can get it to work. Complete the square works all the time, but you may have fractions and it may take you a little longer, but it always works. All right, so there's just some examples. Hopefully that will help you a little bit when you get to your homework or review. All right, sounds good. We'll see ya.